Presented by Caltech.
Our second lecturer today is Claudia Faunt. And Claudia may not have written the book on the hydrology of California, but more importantly, she wrote the model that describes much of how we understand the plumbing of the aquifer systems across the state. And Claudia is at the USGS. She's been there for more than 25 years now. And previous to that, she received her PhD at the Colorado School of Mines. And thank you so much, Claudia, for coming and telling us about the Central Valley in particular.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. So I'm going to kind of build on what Alex had talked about, but kind of focus in on the Central Valley, which is a big focus, a lot of the water issues in California, and tie some of it back to the whole state, but mostly focus on the Central Valley. And I'm going to talk about the conjunctive use of water in the Central Valley and look at some of the historical context, what's going on now, and then maybe some hints as to what we need to do to deal with some of these major water issues into the future, which we'll hopefully build on in this workshop. So why do we want to look at the Central Valley and what's so important about the Central Valley? It's about a 52,000 square kilometer or 20,000 square mile area. It runs, pretty much the length of the state, except for maybe the southern part of California. And it's a heavily agricultural area, and using a small amount of farmland, it produces a huge amount of crops and agriculture for the entire country. And there's also a large amount of water that's produced from this valley relative to the rest of the nation. If you look at the historical time period from about the turn of the century to the present, about 20% of the groundwater that is pumped from the Central Valley out of the U.S. comes from the Central Valley aquifer system. So it's a small area producing a huge amount of the groundwater pumping in the country. And currently that number is hovering around 15% as groundwater is being exploited more throughout the rest of the country as well. So to tie into what Alex was talking about, climate and water resources are very tied in the state, and especially in the Central Valley. And this mimics what he was showing, that the wetter areas to the north and the drier areas to south, and a lot of variability both on an annual basis and a seasonal basis. And you'll see some graphs throughout my talk with kind of gray and white areas representing kind of typical to drier periods, these kind of droughts in white, and kind of a variable to wetter periods with kind of blue bands. And if you think about the state of California and its water resources, there's kind of three reservoir systems. There's the snowpack that Alex talked about. There's our man-made reservoirs that actually hold a lot of the water and control it both for water supply but also for flood control. And then there's the groundwater system, the underground aquifer. And I'm going to focus on this underground aquifer system, but it really reflects what's in this snowpack and in these reservoirs and those releases of water, because all this water is used together and it's used in kind of a conjunctive manner, and that's what conjunctive use means, is that we are using our different water resources together to supply the water we need for both agricultural and municipal and industrial uses. So these dots kind of show the flows coming in from these reservoirs that kind of ring the Central Valley. And one of my previous supervisors told me that California's water issues is that it has a lot of water at the wrong places at the wrong time and not enough water in a lot of the places at the right time. And that kind of sums up the Central Valley and some of its issues with this wetter portion, and even the state, the wetter portions to the north and drier to the south. So water issues have become important more recently, but with the drought, and at least come to the attention of the media and more of a focus for a lot of the state. And there's many ways to look at drought. This is some work that Mike Dettinger and others had done with the CNAP group. And This shows the kind of the snowpack and the reservoirs together that kind of form our surface water system and what's delivered. And then Alex talked at the end in the effect of temperature on this, and you can see in the last 2 years how much warmer it's been and the effect that has had on the snow water equivalent, basically the reservoirs and the snowpack kind of together, and how that's really declined and been one of the major features of this last drought. You can also look at droughts by looking at just like runoff in streams, and from 2012 to 2015. Those kind of 4 water years have been the lowest on record statewide. And there is some variability in that north to south. So if you look at kind of the natural system in the Central Valley and what it was before we kind of changed things, it was extensive kind of wetlands. It's kind of hard to imagine the southern part of the Central Valley in that kind of dry area being an extensive set of wetlands and tule marshes. But the valley's undergone a lot of changes, and partly because it's a great area for agriculture if there's plenty of water. And development began in the 1800s. And one of the things about California's water system is that surface water was addressed early on, and there's been legislation addressing surface water since 1914. But until this last year, groundwater was not regulated. It's kind of a local responsibility. Local people need to deal with it. And kind of a kind of dumbed down, simplified phrase is basically legally any landowner can pump groundwater as long as it's put to a reasonable and beneficial use. And beneficial has a very wide latitude on what beneficial means. Beneficial to one person may not be beneficial to another. And this is true basically except in adjudicated basins, and I think someone later is going to talk more about adjudicated basins and some of the legal aspects of that. So what has happened in the last year is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and that is kind of built on the California Department of Water Resources basin prioritization. And if you look at this chart, the kind of oranges and yellows are the high and medium priority basins. In terms of water use and overall population, it makes a huge percentage of the area in California where water is used and where the people live. So the focus of SGMA is to look at these high and medium priority basins, these orange areas. And if you look at this, the Central Valley is basically covered with all medium and high priority basins. So that's what we're going to kind of focus on here. And what the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is try to get these basins to become sustainable in terms of their groundwater resources. And the sustainability criteria, or like undesirable effects, if you want to phrase it that way, are like lowering of groundwaters, which is tied directly to reduction of groundwater storage, seawater intrusion, which is more of a coastal issue, particularly these southern basins and all these basins kind of here along the coast, water quality degradation, which is a factor in the seawater intrusion, but it's also a factor in a lot of these other basins in terms of as water levels decline, in a lot of times you'll get areas where the water quality deteriorates with depth. And there's also other factors affecting the water quality, but I'm not going to go into water quality very much in this talk. Another ancillary feature in some areas, and particularly important that I'll talk quite a bit about, is land subsidence, and that's a particular factor in the groundwater extraction in the Central Valley. And then there's also the tie of, it's an integrated hydrologic system. The surface water and the groundwater system are tied together, and lowering of groundwater levels often affects the surface water resources and the ecological systems as well. So there's a tie to the depletion of surface water or effects on different environmental factors, including fish species or other effects. So let's kind of dig into like looking at the Central Valley and the effect of the development in irrigated agriculture. That there's been huge changes in the volume and distribution of groundwater recharge and discharge in the Central Valley because of development. And this is also true in a lot of the other basins throughout the state. Kind of a pre-development was a kind of a natural system. We began developing, like putting in wells and using the water resources in the mid-1800s, early to mid-1800s. But most of the data we have to look at this system is much later than that. So we're trying to get back at what happened through time, and also use kind of the present as a key to the past to looking at things that changed. with development, we've basically made an engineered system to move water where we need it and when we need it. And this is a series of canal networks. We also use the natural stream networks and a series of reservoirs to control the inflows. And as Alex talked about, those reservoirs depend on this extra snowpack that's also up in the mountains too, and they're designed based on that snowpack. So things are changing with the global climate changing and with the different periods and patterns. So if you look at the Central Valley, it's basically this large trough. It's filled of sands and gravels and clays. There's a lot of these little fine-grained lenses. In some areas, there's a big, thick clay that basically tends to pressurize part of the system as water is recharged from the mountain fronts, goes into the ground, and moves towards the center of the valley. So water is going to basically move from high areas to low areas. And you can think of this groundwater system as a bank. And basically, in order to balance the amount of water in this system, the ins need to equal the outs. And in nature, nature has figured out a way to kind of make the ins equal the outs, and there's a balance. Well, we've started pumping and taking more water out, and we've changed that system. And kind of the reasons for changing that system, and this is kind of a picture of the valley now, where earlier it was a lot of marshes. Now there's a lot of irrigated agriculture. So about 30% of the area, this tan color, is kind of the native vegetation. So there's still a large part of native vegetation throughout the area, even though the vast majority of the area is covered by different forms of irrigated agriculture. You can look at this map and see these red areas. These are kind of the more urban areas, with Sacramento in this area in here, Fresno area, and different crops with the purples representing vineyards or grapes, kind of a cotton belt and row crops in the southern part. The orange and browns are kind of deciduous trees, and then the light blue is kind of more rice. So we have kind of three main land uses: the native vegetation, the municipal industrial areas, and then the irrigated agriculture. And one of the features about the Central Valley and a lot of places in the state of California is we put in wells to pump water, and we also use surface water to supply these crops, and we do it together. But until recently, those pumping wells were not metered. So we really have no idea of how much water has been pumped, particularly from the Central Valley. We're having to back estimate that based on the land use and the amount of surface water that's been delivered to these different areas. And that's an important thing to keep track of during this talk, is that we really are estimating this amount of groundwater pumpage and this groundwater loss based on ancillary evidence from the different land uses, the amount of surface water that's been delivered, and looking at water level changes and properties of the materials in the valley. So if you look at land use changes, basically in 1920, if we look at native vegetation, there was a slow loss in the area of native vegetation. There's a rapid decline from the early 40s to about 1960. And this is tied partly to the advent of the deep well turbine pump, and also the mechanical harvesting and refrigerated rail transportation. This is what made agricultural expansion possible in the Central Valley. And so there was a large growth from the 40s into the early 60s. There's also been changes in recent times. This graph looks at from 2000 through 2013. This is kind of the fallow and native vegetation kind of goes up and down. But the thing to note is this big increase in kind of fruits and nuts. These are permanent crops. These permanent crops are a large investment for agriculture, and they can't be fallowed. If there's a dry year, they cannot not water those crops because they would lose their investment. So this has changed some of the hydrology and how agriculture had responded to droughts in previous times. They used to be able to fallow land when there was a drought. Now they have to keep irrigating this. And this is driven by economics. I mean, you cannot fault somebody who owns a farm that says, okay, if I put in an acre of almonds or a vineyard, I'm going to make $100,000, but if I put in the same amount of land in tomatoes, I'm only going to make $1,000. I mean, what are you going to choose? You're in this for a business. So this is, it's economics. It's partly driving this, and it's partly what we're going to talk about, you know, in this workshop and throughout these talks. So there's a bunch of underlying factors that are all intertwined here that have, you know, interesting repercussions on each other. So what has this kind of affected the groundwater system? So if you look at this Central Valley aquifers, this bank, there's these ins and outs, and it's relatively a simple system when it's natural. And there's about 2 million acre-feet of water going in and out of the Central Valley aquifer system, going back and forth to the surface water system, the surface water-groundwater interaction, and the kind of natural processes for evapotranspiration and things. We've made this system much more complex in order to deal with what we're using the valley for. And there's now a huge amount of things going back and forth, and there's a lot more water going in and out of the system on top of that. And there's also an overall loss in storage, and we'll talk about more of that in a minute. But we're supplying and dealing with this system through this conjunctive use of surface water and groundwater, and I've talked some about that already, so I won't belabor the point. But what we do is look at the area to see where surface water is delivered and then back out this groundwater pumping in order to get the use of groundwater. And in order to understand all that, we've built the Central Valley Hydrologic model, which is built on a US code called ModFlow. It's on 1 square mile cells. It's calibrated for this kind of recent time period from the 60s through 2000 where we have a lot of data. But we look at changes on a monthly kind of change in stress, the change in pumping and change in climate on these kind of monthly stress periods and simulate kind of close to pre-development times in the 1920s through about 2013. So I'm going to show you some results from looking at that and putting all those pieces together in this model because it makes a tool for us to be able to look at what's going on in the valley. So this is just pulling out one of those kind of 21 areas where we're kind of looking at budgets and trying to understand them, to look at the proportions of surface water and groundwater that's used for irrigation and how that relates to the climate variability or climate change. So 1977, 76, 77 is a well-known drought in the historical period. And if you look at this black line, this is the total demand during a season for water, and it changes a little bit, but it's kind of generally up in this area in here. If you look at the pink line, this is the amount of this demand that's meant by pumping. The blues and greens are 2 different types of surface water delivery. So kind of look at this year, kind of a typical year. Early on in the season, surface water delivery adds up and meets this kind of total demand. And as you get later in the season, there's more groundwater pumping when the surface water isn't available. And that's kind of typically what's happening throughout the valley, kind of in general. In some of these, all right, we'll just in some of these wetter years, you get at a large amount of the demand actually being met by surface water deliveries because there's plenty of surface water. This is becoming fewer and fewer and far between. In dry years, the vast majority of this demand is met by groundwater pumping. And that's when a lot of the loss in storages are occurring. So, go ahead.
It seems like the farm delivery requirements also higher during dry years. Is it just because of evaporation from the soil?
Evaporation and temperature is usually much warmer, so there's more of a consumptive use by the crops and things. And it takes that into account when it's kind of calculating the demand use. But yes, that is a feature that's going on in there as well. So if you put this together and look at the valley as a whole, this red line is kind of the change in groundwater storage. And basically, it's a downward trend. It goes up during these wetter periods, but not enough to make up for the drier and average years when water is being taken out of storage. These green bars are the surface water deliveries. And you can see there's much more surface water delivered in these wet periods and less in the drier periods. There is still surface water available and delivered during these wet periods. It's just less. And it depends on the time of the year and location. And this is the valley as a whole. One of the things when you start looking at this graph at the end, this gets much steeper in these later years because of different curtailments on surface water delivery. So if we try to think about the last few years, because that's what we're all like looking at and trying to understand, the recent drought, the different land use changes, and restrictions on surface water flows, which are partly environmental, they're partly just parts of the infrastructure and movement of the water. And someone's going to talk later much more about the surface water delivery system in this state, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. But basically that's resulted in a huge amount of groundwater pumping, which results in large water level declines, which means loss in groundwater storage. One of the other things in the valley that actually may be more of a factor that's going to really affect the water infrastructure and maybe more of a management criteria is land subsidence, as well as salinity issues. I'm going to talk some about land subsidence and how that's affecting the infrastructure and maybe part of the issues that will actually be one of the big drivers in terms of the groundwater sustainability and actually trying to keep our surface water delivery system working. So what is land subsidence? This is a very famous kind of photo of Joe Poland. He's kind of thought of as one of the fathers for trying to understand land subsidence, particularly in the Central Valley, but throughout the state of California. And basically, he made a mock-up of this spot in the western San Joaquin Valley, showing where land surface would have been in 1925. The land has sunk just from the pumping of groundwater in this area by almost 30 feet, about 28 feet by this time. And so like in 1955 is there. Michelle Sneed has been doing a lot of work on, and my colleague at the USGS in Sacramento, she's been doing a lot of work on subsidence. She went and found one of the areas that is currently subsiding at a more faster rate. And I'll talk more about this, but the areas where land subsidence is occurring changes spatially as well as temporally. And so you can see that at certain times at this kind of benchmark where we're able to measure the actual land surface altitude, there's times when there's not much land subsidence, and then this is a 4-year period, and then for this 5-year period, which has a pretty big drought in it from 2007 to 2009, there's been a lot more land subsidence. So basically what land subsidence is if you think of the valley as full of all these sands and clays, a large part of the valley is also a lot of these clay particles that are flat, kind of plate-like minerals or deposits. And they're all at random orientations throughout the valley, and they form little lenses. And they're kind of supported and suspended in the water and haphazard. Like if you think of your dinner plates all thrown into your sink, after dinner and at random orders, they take up a lot of space. As you wash them or as you pump water out of the ground, these particles lay flat and stack. And they stack up into a nice, neat mass. And when they do that, they take up less space. And so if you see these random oriented particles versus these kind of more stacked, nice flat-lying particles, these little lenses compress down. So this kind of fat area here has now squunched down into much smaller space. And to do that, there's been a permanent loss of storage in the basin. It's taken up by these finer grained materials that don't transport as much water, but there is a permanent loss of storage. And this loss of storage is kind of shown at the land surface by a dropping of the land surface or land subsidence where the ground sinks. Some of the effects from land subsidence are kind of surface features like cracks. There aren't as many of these in the Central Valley as in other areas, but there have been some in the past. But you can see things that are anchored deeper in the system. Like this is a speculation oil well that the farmer painted orange at the land surface at 2010 so the machinery wouldn't run into it. And then he went back and looked at that same pole 2 years later, and this much more of it is sticking out of the ground. So basically that's tied to the deeper part of the system, so the ground is sinking around this well. This also causes wells to break and break the casing and things, and for groundwater wells that can be a big problem, but this is more looking at the surface sinking. There's been bending and cracks in the concrete delivery system. There's bridges. This is an actual bridge where they had to build walls along it because the canal that's delivering the water, so the canal infrastructure, this area has sunk, but the water level has to be kept at a gradient to deliver water from here to here. And to keep that gradient, the water level is higher here now because the ground has basically sunk. So now the water level in this canal is above the bridge level, so the water that should be going under the bridge is now backing up against the bridge. And so this bridge is going to have to basically be replaced. So you've got just break and cracks in the infrastructure, some changes to rebuild this infrastructure, roads and things that have to be rebuilt to deal with some of the land subsidence. So one of the big effects from subsidence is the effect on the infrastructure. So how do we measure land subsidence? There's quite a variety of methods. They each have different features that make them better than others. We look at these benchmarks like Michelle was standing at. We have these devices to measure the amount of land subsidence and compaction that's occurring under the ground. We use satellite data, and Tom Farr is going to talk more about this later in the week. And all these different types of methods. It's one of the more recent things that we've been able to capitalize on is on continuous GPS data that's being captured to look at some of the plate observatory data. So if you look at some recent subsidence, you can see that these red areas are where a lot of subsidence has occurred during this 2007 to 10-ish time frame drought. There's shown in these red areas. These purple dots represent continuous GPS and extensometer data where we've also been measured at point locations. So you can start to see there's actually been some subsidence up in the Sacramento Valley as well as the southern part of the valley in the San Joaquin Basin. Historically, these aqua lines represents our surface water delivery infrastructure. This is the Delta-Mendota Canal. This is the California Aqueduct that brings water to Southern California from the northern part of the state. There was a lot of subsidence in this part of the valley. Part of why the Delta-Mendota Canal was built and some of the other infrastructure was to alleviate these large water level declines and a large amount of subsidence on the western side of the valley. And partly why all this subsidence has started occurring now is we thought subsidence was licked, it was no longer a problem, we kind of quit looking at it, kind of quit starting to measure it and think about it. Basically, the locations of subsidence have changed. And so now the new kind of hot spots for subsidence, this area is similar, a little bit locational change, but this is a whole new area of subsidence. And this area is basically where this is a flood control canal over here, but basically this area has little access to surface water, but has been planted in permanent crops. And so there's been a lot of pumping in this area without surface water infrastructure to bring surface water. So there's been new subsidence in this area, but this older area over here, there really hasn't been much subsidence. This is the area kind of where the telephone pole was. So what we did was also try to look at the geology and what was going on underneath the ground and try to characterize it. And based on thousands of drillers' wells, there's hundreds and thousands of drillers' wells, but we kind of made a database of about 10,000 and built kind of what we're calling a texture model. Basically, the warm areas are in these oranges and yellows are the coarse-grained areas, kind of big alluvial fans, and these bluer areas are the clayer, finer-grained areas. And so basically this defines the sediment characteristics. So we tried to use that into conjunction with the subsidence information to try to look to see if there's a geologic tie to where the subsidence is occurring. And there definitely is some geologic control. These big glaciated alluvial fans that are higher energy and coarser grained deposits, these areas were shown in kind of the warmer colors on that last map, have much less subsidence. It's these finer grained deposits where there's also pumping occurring that tends to have this, the subsidence. So there are some geologic controls. There's also vertical geologic changes that affect this as well. So if you look at water levels, these are this is the land surface, a continuous GPS site. So the land surface is going down here. The water level in the shallow well is very flat, whereas water levels I didn't put the water level on this well on here for the deeper part of the system, but the water levels are going down, kind of mimicking this GPS marker. If you look at that extensometer, which is anchored above the Corcoran clay, so in the shallow part of the system, there hasn't been a lot of subsidence there. So from this, we know that most of the compaction in this area, at least, is occurring deeper in the system. And so it's the deeper part of the system that's actually compacting and causing the subsidence here. So a variety of different methods are kind of needed to get at where subsidence is occurring and what's happening. So if you start to look at groundwater levels, which is shown in this blue line here, they tend to decline as more pumping occurs during a drought. They recover in between droughts. And one of the things with subsidence that occurs is these water level changes are much more dramatic because you've lost storage in the system. These clay particles have compacted. And so water levels respond. They go up and they go down much faster than they did before. But if you look at this land surface change and these water level change, they kind of mimic each other. This shows kind of a little bit more rapid recovery because of this loss of storage. And the renewed subsidence during the drought is partly tied to reduced surface water importation and this reliance on groundwater resources. In this area, there's a recovery and there's a stopping of the compaction, in between droughts. So there's surface water in this area, and we've looked at the area and there's surface water. Some areas, there appears to be like just a continual decline. And even in between droughts, the water levels have dropped. In this area, there is little surface water available, so they're pumping all the time to feed these crops. So there's a problem in most areas. It's enhanced during droughts, but there are areas that don't have surface water that this is now occurring and a problem even in between droughts. So this isn't it's kind of doom and gloom, but there's ways and tools that we can start to look at things. We can use the models and things to try to get out where we can do things differently. Where can we pump? Maybe we can pump from the upper part of the system instead of the lower part of the system because we can see most of the compaction is occurring there. Maybe we can get surface water to certain areas or have different crops growing in different areas based on their likelihood to compact because we know something about the geologic conditions. We can also think of this system that's a bank. Okay, well, we're taking water out. Maybe we could get more water in. Maybe we can think in between these droughts when we have wet periods, can we spread the water out and have it infiltrate into the ground? Can we water less efficiently with surface water so it actually acts like a recharge system and more efficiently with groundwater so we're using less groundwater but actually getting more surface water into the groundwater system? So we need to kind of look at our bank and what can we do to enhance the bank and enhance our ends and our deposits. If you start to look at managed aquifer recharge, it's been occurring for a while, but it's really accelerated in the last few years, and this has really helped the water levels to recover, particularly in the southern part of the basin in the Kern County area. So we're putting a lot of water in during these wet periods and taking more out during these drier periods. So to try to kind of tie to the past, present, and future, conjunctive use in kind of California, maybe the poster child for using water conjunctively, using our surface water and our groundwater together to meet our demands. We've been doing that for a while, and that's to try to kind of get at and minimize damage and quantity or quality of the resource. But we're not doing very well at that, particularly in the Central Valley. So we're trying to look at sustainability, and that's what that most recent legislation was about. How do we make this system sustainable? And how do we use water in a manner that we can be maintained for like an indefinite amount of time and without causing environmental or economic or social consequences? So we need to figure out how to make it more sustainable. And to do that, we're going to have to adapt. And we're going to have to figure out how to adapt to climate variability and climate change. If the snowpack is really changing in the reservoirs, and if you look at the historical data and even this more recent drought, there's much more variability in the system. There's wetter periods and there's drier periods, and the snow line appears to be moving up. The bloom time on a lot of the crops has changed by almost 30 days. So there's signs that things are changing, and we need to figure out how to adapt, and maybe adapt the types of crops and what we're growing and how we're using our water, and align that with changes in policies. And one of the neat hallmarks for that legislation is that it's basically centered on local users figuring out how to deal with their problem and working with their neighbor. The way that I think that legislation got passed, that it was in a drought, so people were thinking about this being a problem. but basically that the local water purveyors would work together and figure out how to solve their problem, and each system and each group or entity can solve it differently. And maybe some people will bring in more surface water, maybe some people will change their agricultural use, some people will figure out more efficient ways for doing things, but the local entities will figure out how to solve that problem. But land use changes, changes in surface water flows and restrictions for a variety of reasons, and this climate variability and enhanced by kind of climate change has a big effect on the groundwater system and a big effect on our hydrology. And we need tools to look at this, to figure out how we can respond and what will work and what may not work, and look at satellite information to look at and analyze trends on kind of a regional scale. But things need to work together to try to deal with. And it's a large agricultural output and a large economic value, maybe not one of the largest parts of California's economy, but there's a lot of ag that's developed and used throughout the country and grown in the Central Valley, and it's an important issue to try to figure out. And with that, I will answer questions or